Hey everyone, I'm Almar of almarsguides.com, and in this video here, I'm going to be talking to you about ranged builds in Dungeon Siege 2. So this video is part of my series on Dungeon Siege 2, where I break down each of the different specializations, give you a little bit of information about each, and the builds they can do and stuff like that. This series is a little bit more podcasty in nature. I'm basically just like playing the game as I'm narrating to you what I've learned from 500 hours of playing the game. If you would like proof of that, there you go. 514 hours put into Dungeon Siege 2, which I would say is quite a bit. So let's jump in and start talking about the ranged build. So first I'm going to talk about the two different builds. Well, few more than two, but there's two main builds you can do with ranged, and then I'm going to break down the spells you'll be using and all of that fun stuff. So to get started with ranged, you basically have two options. You can either do bow and crossbow, which they're lumped together in the same category, or you can do throwing weapons. So bow and crossbow covers the top of the tree, and throwing weapons covers the bottom of the tree, with an exception for survival and dodge. They're universal and not related to throwing weapons. Also, penetrate right here. This works for both bow and crossbows as well as throwing weapons. However, stuff like ricochet and stuff like that will only work for throwing weapons as they have specified. Usually, if a town only works for a specific sort of weapon, it will tell you. So, like here, throwing weapon. See, bleed, it doesn't say that it only works for yeah, it does, throwing weapons. So bleed will only work for throwing weapons, even though it doesn't say it in the, like, whatever, where it tells you how much damage per second it does and how long the duration lasts. But at the very start of the town, it does say thrown weapon masters prefer to get closer to their target. So that lets you know that it only works for thrown weapons in general. So aside from bow and crossbow, you also have technically one other option to do for range, which is Blood Assassin. Now, Blood Assassin, you won't have access to this unless you're playing in the Broken World expansion pack, which is where the gameplay footage that is currently on your screen right now is coming from. And Blood Assassin is a hybrid combat/ranged build, although I would say it doesn't really hybridize combat at all. There's like nothing in it that is good for combat in particular. However, the whole top of the build, the whole top of the tree, as you can see on this character, is all amazing for ranged. And we're going to talk about this a little bit too, but I'll talk about Blood Assassin more in my specific build guide for Blood Assassins. This one will mostly focus entirely on ranged characters instead. So, bow and crossbow. What is the difference between the two? Well, bows and crossbows deal a lot more single target damage. Like you can see this bow right here, and also bow and crossbows have further distance than throwing weapons. Like this bow has rather low overall damage. It only goes up to 132 despite being a level 82 bow. You'll find crossbows that go up into like the 300s at this level, but they attack I think like twice as slow, or maybe like
No one is
a little bit less than that. We'll have to see. But bows, essentially, the comparison between bows and crossbows. Bows attack slightly faster than crossbows. Well, almost twice as fast as crossbows. Sorry, hiccup. Bows attack almost twice as fast as crossbows. Crossbows attack slower but deal more damage. So it's the trade-off that you have to make. Do you want to deal more damage with each hit? Or do you want to attack faster and deal more prolonged damage, I guess would be the way to describe it? I'm not entirely sure. Now, there's a bigger difference between bow and crossbows and throwing weapons. Throwing weapons, in my honest opinion, are more designed for AoE DPS. Whereas bow and crossbows are more designed for single target DPS. Now, the reason for this is not only penetrate, but ricochet. See ricochet right here, which it basically gives you a chance that your throwing weapons will pierce through the target and hit other targets. And each time it pierces through the target, it will actually do more damage, not less damage. Because, well, depending on how many talent points you have into it, of course. You can see mine is at 5, and mine does 107% projectile damage. Technically 101% for the current skill level that I am at. But that's basically doing 1% more damage per ricochet that it does. However, if I click on Ameren, who is my throwing weapons character, as you can see, his does about 50% more damage per ricochet. So that's something to keep in mind. Now let's look at Ameren, since he's a throwing weapons character. You'll see in the bottom of his tree right here is all filled in, whereas with Vix, the whole top of the tree. Now, you have to decide what powers you would like to use. Well, actually, let me add a little bit more about throwing weapons and bows and crossbows. Depending on what powers you want to use and what sort of ranged character you would like to play, that mostly determines which of these two you want to use. If you're going to be strictly ranged and you're not going to mess with any Blood Assassin skill trees or powers, or, well, rather, if you're not going to mess with any Blood Assassin powers, you definitely want to mess with the Blood Assassin skill trees because they're too good to refuse and turn down. However, the Blood Assassin powers, in my honest opinion, work better with throwing weapons than they do ranged. Specifically, you have Execute. Let me click on Ameren since he's actually a Blood Assassin. You have Execute, which basically every character, every enemy that is under the effects of your mark, which is right here, Mark of the Harvest, you see I'm using on Ameren. And these are Blood Assassin abilities that's worth mentioning, so we're kind of off the beaten path as far as range goes. But Execute will deal more damage to every single enemy that you have marked, and you can't mark an enemy unless you hit it. Therefore, throwing weapons paired with Ricochet and paired with Penetrate is probably the best build you can get for Blood Assassins, because you're going to hit more targets, you're going to mark more targets, which means when you execute, you're going to deal more damage. Now, if you're a Blood Assassin that doesn't use Execute and you use Rune of Blood or something like that, then you won't have to worry too much about it. But it's something definitely worth keeping in mind. Now, let's go back to ranged. Looking over these skills, what are the most important ones to get for bow and crossbow? Well, I think basically everything is important except for Far Shot. I don't just personal preference. I don't really care that I can attack enemies from a further distance, because most of the time I'm not really running away or kiting enemies anyway, so attacking them at a further distance really does not offer me that much of a benefit. Also, it's worth mentioning that bow and crossbow gets access to Mortal Wound, and this only works for bow and crossbow abilities, and it increases your overall crit damage, which just kind of more so amplifies the fact that bow and crossbow is good for single target and not as good for AoE. Whereas throwing weapons, instead of the bonus crit damage, they get Ricochet, which allows them to hit more enemies. Also, your powers, I would say, for throwing weapons are more geared towards AoE as well, whereas your powers for bow and crossbow are more geared towards single target damage. So let's look at the powers real fast, and then I'm going to go through the skill tree and Blood Assassin tree to show you what other skills you want to invest in. So as far as powers, Take Aim, I like this ability. It's basically the same exact thing as Brutal Attack, although I have this issue where Take Aim does not work if I'm not currently playing that character. So let me show you. I'm going to activate Take Aim on Vix, but I'm not controlling Vix. I'm actually controlling Daru right now, or Tar, sorry. And Vix will not activate his Take Aim. Like you'll be able to see here, if you look at Vix's character portrait on the left side of the screen, Take Aim is like activated. It shows that instead of his normal melee attack, and it also shows that at the bottom of the screen. However, Take Aim won't actually fire. Like you can see Vix shooting right there in the bottom of the screen, yet Take Aim is not actually activated. If I actually click on Vix though, the next attack will fire off with Take Aim. Now let me show you. Bang, Take Aim went. Oh wow, it didn't. That's interesting. Now it did, because I activated it again. So that is the downside with Take Aim. I don't know why it does that. Brutal Attack does not do that. Only Take Aim does that. So I'm kind of recommending against that talent unless you plan to actually play your archer nonstop. Now let's go through a few of the others, and you'll be able to see a lot of numbers flashing on my screen because I activated Charged Shots, which is one of my favorite talents or favorite powers for ranged. So Thunderous Shot Thunderous Shot is like a better version of the Blood Assassin Ravaging Strike ability. Thundering Shot, basically, it fires an arrow in a straight line, and all enemies hit by it are dealt a lot of damage, and they are stunned for a decently long duration. Now, you have to ask yourself if, well, rather, the one big downside with Thundering Shot is you have to aim this ability. I honestly cannot stand abilities that you have to aim on every single character. So you have to basically pick and choose what abilities you would want. And the reason I don't like powers that you have to aim on a bunch of characters is because it's very hard keeping track of where all of my characters are. So, like, for example, if I'm using Nature Mages and I'm using Icicle Blast does like a cone. It shoots out a cone of damage in front of the Nature Mage. And if I don't know where my Nature Mage is, I won't be able to position Icicle Blast properly. Now, with Thundering Shots, you can position it like you'll be given a little cone. Let me activate it real fast so I can show you. You'll be given a little cone that shows you which direction you want the arrow to fly in. However, if you don't know where your archer is at the minute, you're not going to know where the arrow is flying from. So, it's basically, if you can keep track of your characters at all times, then it might be worth using. Otherwise, I would kind of recommend against it. I think there's better abilities and powers out there. So, Silence, I don't use at all because I've never really had to silence an enemy from casting spells at me. So it's never really been something that I've cared too much about, and it doesn't do damage, so I don't really care. Like, I don't really care to use it that much. Now, Charged Shots, this is my favorite power for ranged in the entire game, and I would actually recommend using this power for Blood Assassins too. It's that good. Essentially, it charges your shots with lightning, and every enemy that is around the target you're shooting at is hit with lightning. Also, any enemy that is standing around you is hit with lightning too, because basically, like, your character just engulfs himself in lightning. And here, let me show you actually. Your character basically just engulfs himself in lightning. Let me get to a large pack of enemies up here. And not only do his attacks deal lightning, but basically anybody that's standing around him will suffer from lightning damage as well. And it is fantastic. It does a shit ton of damage, and it also is great against bosses too, because it's not like it does less damage when it's hitting a single target. So it's good for AoE damage, and it's good for boss killing, which is the main reason that I like it so much. So like here, pop Charged Shots. Well, actually, apparently it doesn't hit enemies around me. Interesting. I totally thought it did. Well, makes it a little bit worse, but it's still good. As you can see, though, it does quite a bit of damage. A lot of those big numbers are coming from Vix. A lot of the smaller ones are coming from other characters, so keep that in mind. So let's go through the other abilities, too. Shrapnel Blast. This is a throwing weapons ability, and it's one of the better ones in the range tree. Basically, it's just like an AoE damage in an area of your choosing. If you're familiar with, like, Detonate, the combat magic skill, or really any ability that you just, like, target an AoE area and then it makes a big-ass explosion, it's basically what Shrapnel Blast does. Repulse. Essentially, all Repulse does is push enemies away from you. So it's not too bad if you're playing like a mostly ranged party. You can pop Repulse on one of your characters and basically keep all enemies away from your entire party. However, if you're playing a mixed party, there's not much use for it, in my opinion. There's better talents. Better skills, rather. So, Flurry. Let's click on Ameren since, well, he actually doesn't even have those. Flurry is another one of these abilities that I would highly recommend for single target damage, and it is another one that's built for throwing weapons. So essentially how this works is throwing weapons, you'll want to use Shrapnel. Is it Shrapnel Blast or just Shrapnel Blast? You want to use Shrapnel Blast when you're dealing AoE damage to a bunch of enemies at once. And you want to use Flurry when you're doing single target damage against bosses or things like that. For an actual ranged character with a bow and crossbow, I would recommend Charged Shots and really nothing but Charged Shots. If you want to use take aim on bosses, you can, but you're going to run into the issue that I showed you earlier with take aim where it, like, half of the time works. And, well, rather not half of the time works, but it doesn't work unless you're actually the one controlling the ranged character when you hit it. So that's something you have to keep in mind. And it's worth reiterating, for throwing weapons, you're going to want to use Shrapnel Blast for AoE damage, and you're going to want to use Flurry for single target damage. You definitely will have to switch back and forth between the two. That's pretty common for a lot of builds in this game. Sorry, I'm just doing some transmuting right now of all this vendor trash. It is pretty common for you to have to transfer back and forth between two different powers, depending on if you're fighting a boss or if you're fighting regular enemies. So that's not too big of a deal. And let's take a look at the other abilities, or the other powers in the Blood Assassin tree that may or may not be useful or worth getting for you, depending on what you want to do. So it's worth mentioning that when you first start out a character, or when you're spending talent points, you're going to want to figure out what powers you want to use. One thing about Flurry, the talent that I just brought up, is it requires Cunning Renewal, which is one of the less useful, for lack of better words, ranged abilities. I really don't like talents that increase the recovery rate of your powers, because I find that my powers are almost always up anyway, and I'm like just waiting for situations to where I would be able to use said power. So apparently I don't have a combat magic ability. I can figure this out. So in order to use Flurry, you're basically going to have to waste some of your talent points into Cunning Renewal. Do you want to do that? That is a question that basically only you will be able to answer. Your alternative is to just, instead of using Flurry for bosses, use Take Aim for bosses. And then you would have to play the ranged character when you want to activate Take Aim, which I guess isn't too big of a deal, but, you know, to each their own. And that's what you'll need to decide. As far as Blood Assassin, now, this suffers from the same sort of issue. Blood Assassin, a lot of the powers... Sorry, hiccups. A lot of the powers in the Blood Assassin tree require you to waste a lot of talent points on useless shit. So let's take a look at it. As you can see, Ameren, I got a bunch of talent points into the bottom of the tree. Basically, like, I would say these 15 points are kind of wasted, because I specifically chose them so I could use the Rune of Blood power. And Execute, kind of, too. It's one of the other powers that I'd like, but I haven't been using too much recently. But I had to, in order to use those powers, I had to spend all of those points there, which don't give me much use outside of making my power better. And that might not appeal to a lot of you out there. It's something you'll have to figure out yourself, depending on, you know, what powers you want to use and stuff like that. But let me pour it out of here and get to the next area where I need to go. It's up to you. Like I said, you have to figure out which powers you want when you first start, and you start planning out where you would like to go, what you would like to do. Also, it's worth mentioning that there is an NPC that will respec your abilities for you in the Broken World expansion pack. You can find them right in the Dryad Outpost. So if you would like to experiment around, I totally recommend you do it, because you can just respec once you get to Broken World. Let me figure out where I have to go for this one quest, and then we'll continue talking about a few other things that I want to bring up. Kalinor Stronghold. Okay. So, let's jump back into my specializations. So for throwing weapons, as I said before, throwing weapons I think make good Blood Assassins, which is why Ameren, my throwing weapons ranged character, is a Blood Assassin. Now, look at what abilities Vix has in the Blood Assassin tree versus the one Ameren has. So, if you would like to pause the video here, this is Ameren's, and you've seen Vix's prior, but now I'm telling you to look at the screen. Now, here's Vix's. Now, it's worth mentioning that the upper half of the tree, the ones that both Vix and Ameren have, are basically good abilities that are universal for all ranged characters. It's worth mentioning that Shred Blood, as well as Ignite Blood, as well as Bleed, the other ability in ranged, all of these stack. So you can stack Bleed, Ignite Blood, and Shred Blood all together. So that's another really, really good reason that you want throwing weapons that hit multiple targets, because you'll only be able to inflict a target with these dots if you actually hit them with your weapon. Therefore, hitting multiple targets will give you a better chance of spreading around your dots, which will obviously increase your overall DPS. Now, you might be looking at stuff like Ignite Blood and being like, yeah, well, 70 damage over 5 seconds, I mean, that's kind of low, right? And yes, it is. However, it stacks with everything else, and that's good. That's quite good, actually, if you think about everything stacking together, because it basically just adds up all of the overall damage you do. So let's take a look. I do about 420 damage with my Bleed from ranged, which increases with dexterity. I'm not sure if that shows if that just shows the base damage or the multiplied damage after all of my dexterity boosts. And then we look over here. So that's 405. Well, that's another 300 actually, since it's 294. It's basically there. So that is, what was the other one? Sorry, I'm terrible at remembering numbers. Okay, 420 along with 300. So about 700 damage on top of the Ignite Blood, which we can just round up to like 800 damage. So that's about 800 damage from all of our bleeds stacking together, which is a lot of damage added all up and put together.
What? No.
Yeah, because I don't care about the Overmage or the Sinbri. Now, looking at the top of the Blood Assassin tree again, like I said, these are abilities and skills you're definitely going to want to get if you are a ranged character. A lot of these, weapon enhancement power, this is going to boost your weapon enhancement, which I strongly recommend you use. It doesn't matter if you split XP between combat and ranged, if you just plan on being a straight up ranged character, because in this game, unless you multi-class, you're going to get a lot of spillover XP. So that's worth mentioning. If you're just playing a ranged character and you don't really give that much of a shit about the Blood Assassin powers and stuff like that, I recommend you use Shade's Agility. This is a weapon enhancement that will boost your overall agility significantly. And it will also split the damage you do between combat and ranged, but that's not that big of a deal. Looking at the ranged tree, or looking at the Blood Assassin tree again, weapon enhancement power, getting like 5 to 10 points in this is good because it'll boost your weapon enhancement significantly. Living Death. This one is hit or miss depending on the player, I would say. You need Living Death in order to get, I think, this one, which increases your dexterity and intelligence. It's just a 1-pointer. So Living Death, basically, you sacrifice fire damage res for physical damage res. Now, physical damage is a lot more common than fire res. However, if you get too many points into Living Death, you'll gimp yourself quite badly when it comes to really anything that deals fire damage. So keep that in mind and keep an eye out for that. Don't overdo it for physical damage resistance. And then you also have this, Blood-Soaked Shots. Now this is a big one because it gives you flat damage boosts, which is very, very good. So as you can see, this one increases my attack damage by 33% for the current rank that it is. And I also, each shot I deal costs me 2% of my total health. So that is the trade-off. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, like, that sucks. And indeed, it kind of does suck. But watch my Vix's health. Notice how I'm not really taking damage. Like, you can see my health, it'll go down and then immediately go up. And this is for a few reasons. One is I guarantee I have health steal. There you go, 2% health steal on my ring. So that kind of like, I wonder if 2% health steal is 2% of your total health. Not entirely sure, but you can see my Planeswalker relic right here. This comes with 11% health steal. So I have enough health steal on all of my gear to basically counter any damage that I'm dealing to myself with each ranged shot. So basically, I turn the downside into an upside with my gear. Or I negate the downside is a better way of looking at it. So the last really abilities in Blood Assassin that you would possibly want are Hemorrhage, which increases your shred blood damage, Ignite Blood, which we've talked about before, and that's really it. If you're just the ranged character, that is. If you're going to be a Blood Assassin, then there's a little bit more you want to invest in. Then you might look at some of the abilities in the Blood Assassin tree, like Shred Blood, and be like, well, it increases with intelligence, and I don't really care that much about intelligence, so why should I really bother with it? And you are somewhat right. Like, it does increase the damage with intelligence, and if you had more intelligence, it would deal more damage. However, having intelligence is not a prerequisite for getting Shred Blood, and Shred Blood dealing even halfway decent damage. The way you should look at Shred Blood is it's just another ability that's going to increase your overall damage, which is why it's so useful. Now, let's look at a few of... actually, let's look at the spell... Well, we'll go through the rest of the abilities real fast, then we'll switch to the spell book. As far as melee goes, there's a lot of abilities you want to get in the melee tree. Let me go to Ameren since he actually has some points spent in there. I recommend Fortitude, Toughness, and Reinforced Armor. They're all very, very important because they're going to overall boost your survivability quite a bit. We didn't kill that guy in time, but that's fine. Now, range, we've already gone over this. Survival and dodge are the only two we haven't talked about yet. And survival and dodge are very good not only for your character, your ranged character, but all your characters. I definitely recommend you put at least 5 points into them, depending on how many plus skills you have. Basically, you want to invest enough points into them to the point of where they start giving you really diminishing returns, then you'll want to move on to something else. And usually, in my experience, abilities start giving you pretty bad diminishing returns when you get them to about 10 to 12. Then they start giving you, like, instead of 1% increase, you get like 0.5% increase. And it's at that point, that's where I like to start spending other skill points elsewhere. Nature Magic, you need to decide if you want to use a pet on your character. You also need to decide if you want to use a buff. Well, actually, we're looking at combat magic when talking about nature magic, but combat magic, there's really nothing in there that's too useful unless you plan to use a curse, like Drown on one of your characters. Then you'll want to maybe get some points into debilitation, but that's really it for combat magic. You don't want to use any active spells. You don't want to actually like cast Fireball sometimes or something like that on your multi-classed ranged character. Just stick to throwing weapons or stick to bows and crossbows. Let the combat mages do all the pew-pewing. So, Vix, I'm pretty sure he has some nature. No, he does not. So, if you want a pet, you'll want to get the top 3 talents in nature magic. The first 2 will increase summon pet's health. Next one will increase the summon damage, or the damage of the summoned pet, which is great if you want to boost your overall damage. And then last but not least, Summon Bond. It transfers some of the damage that you take to your pet, which will greatly boost your overall survivability. Which is one of the only reasons I would recommend you actually use a pet on your ranged character to boost your overall survivability. Blood Assassin we've already gone through, and Fist of Stone. This is the last talent tree that we haven't talked about, and the only one in here that I recommend you get is Chant of Stone. But it's only really useful if you have a lot of intelligence. Basically, Chant of Stone will increase your overall survivability, which is insanely important. And if you would like to see a more detailed breakdown of all of these skills, check out the build guides on my website, almarsguides.com, and you'll be able to find them in the Dungeon Siege 2 section. I break down these builds and pretty much all you need to know about them in much more detail in the text-based guides. These are kind of just like companion guides to go along with it for people who would rather listen than read. So, last but not least, let's talk about the spell books and the spells you want to use on your ranged characters. So, as I said before, Mark of the Harvest, the one you're looking at in this spell book, you'll mostly only want to use this for Blood Assassins. And specifically, only Blood Assassins that are really specializing in the Execute power. I don't think marks are really worth using unless you plan to use Execute. although it does add a little bit of damage to my ranged weapon, it really doesn't do anything unless we hit the execute. So Corp Transmutation, this is a very good one for buffing the survivability of your character. Basically, it just converts a corpse nearby to armor and gives that to you. It is, since ranged characters don't have a lot of armor to begin with, it is a great way to buff your armor and give you more survivability. Also, it's worth mentioning, although I don't have Finale with me right now, there is a... I don't think I have any character with Repulsion. No, I do not, sadly. There is also a weapon enhancement you can get called Repulsion, which will increase your armor by 20% and also knock back enemies that are fighting you. This is actually more... like, it's better, I would say, for combat mages than it is for ranged characters, because the increased armor is phenomenal if you want to increase your survivability. In Dungeon Siege 2, armor is the bread and butter stat if you want to increase your survivability. Armor will decrease all physical damage that you take, and it might also decrease damage from other sources too. I'm not entirely sure though. So aside from Repulsion, looking at my spellbook, we have Shade's Agility, which is one of the other very, very good weapon enhancements you can get. It increases your overall dexterity, which will increase your overall damage. As for your active spells, I recommend you put a Resurrect on as many characters as you possibly can, just so you can switch to in case, you know, a whole bunch of characters die and your Ranger is the last one left alive. Summon Teleporter is a good choice as well, for obvious reasons. Transmute is a good choice as well. In order to use all of these skills, you only need to raise Nature Magic like 3 or 4 times, and then you're good to go. And then, of course, like I said, you have to decide if you want to use a pet or not. For Vix, I'm using a pet just because I like using pets. And in the Broken World, you don't have to worry about pets being too annoying because there's no elevators to screw you over. So, your choice if you want to use a pet or not. I recommend actually don't dump too many points into the pet talents, because ranged characters have a lot of skills rather, that they have to get. So dumping points into the pet skills are not as effective. Like looking at the range tree and the Blood Assassin tree, there's a lot in there to get. You're never going to max out all of the skills that are useful for you. So for that reason, I don't recommend wasting too many points into unnecessary things that aren't going to boost your damage overall as much. And that really covers mostly all there is to the ranged specialization in Dungeon Siege 2. The only other thing that's worth mentioning is Enveloping Embrace and Feral Wrath. These are 2 very important skills that you can get on whatever character you're using either a Wrath or Embrace buff on. So I like to use Spirit Embrace right here, which increases my fire, ice, and lightning resist. It also makes me immune to curses. And I like to use Wrath of the Bear, which increases my overall critical hit damage, which you'll see here, Wrath of the Bear. Now, you want to get these skills on characters that basically have an abundance of skill points, which is why I've gotten one on my dual wield character for melee, because she doesn't need too many skill points to become really, really good. And I got one on my Fist of Stone character because he's already specializing into nature anyway, so it's just worthwhile to get it on him instead. But if you would like to get one on your ranged character, you know, that's your choice. And that's really all there is to it. Hopefully this video covered basically everything you guys need to know about playing a ranged character in Dungeon Siege 2. If you have any questions or you feel that I've left anything out, please leave a comment below and let everybody know. Otherwise, don't forget to like the video, and if you would like to see more video game videos that are similar to this, feel free to subscribe to me, because I'm always uploading videos for games that I find fun and games that I'm currently playing. Anyway, that's all there is to it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I will catch you guys around in my next Dungeon Siege 2 video, which I'm going to be covering Blood Assassins, and then last but not least, we're going to be doing Nature Mages. Anyway, catch you guys later.